Welcome to Hub Dialogues. I'm your host, Sean Speer, editor-at-large at The Hub. I'm honored to be back in conversation with award-winning journalist and best-selling author Amanda Lang for another installment of our bi-weekly video and podcast series on the key issues concerning Canadian business, economics, and public policy. In today's episode, we're discussing the recently resolved PSAC strike in Ottawa and the ongoing screenwriter strike in Hollywood, and the questions these cases raise about the so-called right to strike, the role of modern trade unions, and how tight labor markets may be affecting the power dynamics between employers and workers. Then we'll wrap up our conversation with the unusual case of the Florida Panthers banning Canadian residents from buying tickets for their upcoming home games against the Toronto Maple Leafs. Amanda, thanks for joining me.
Great to see you.
We're speaking 2 days into the strike on the part of the Writers Guild of America, which has led to the cancellation of late-night talk shows, Saturday Night Live, and possibly other comedy and drama series. It comes on the heels of the conclusion of a 12-day strike of federal public servants in Canada, which was one of the largest in the country's history. These two cases are obviously different in certain ways, but it does lead to basic questions about the so-called right to strike. What's your thoughts, Amanda? How do you think about these major labor actions in particular and the role of strikes in general?
Yeah, I mean, we should caution, of course, we all hope that the tentative agreement between the feds and PSAC is ratified. There is one, as we know, subsector union inside PSAC that is saying they won't sign on. So let's asterisk that. We hope that this is over. The economy can't really afford for it to go on too long. Over time, I've kind of evolved my view on this, because on the one hand, you can think of activities where striking is terrible. We do not want ambulance drivers to go on strike. And for most of us, when it happens, teachers, baggage handlers at the airport, it's maximum inconvenience. And of course, that is the point. If it didn't inconvenience all of us, it wouldn't work. So then you have to go, okay, well, fine. The point is to be inconvenient. Why do they get to do that? And you go to, is there still a massive imbalance in the power? The point of a union is to address the fact that the individual worker doesn't have the power, the ability to negotiate properly on their own behalf. Is that still true? And I guess, you can make the case that in some places, and certainly in a big bureaucracy, you can make the case. Now, we could spend hours on what unions do. And I'm sure you have thoughts to kind of degrade the quality of work or the way we think about workers or meritocracies. But in this case, I would say, I don't know would you agree it's kind of a necessary evil? I mean, until we actually have, not everybody is a superstar who can negotiate a contract on their own behalf and walk if it doesn't work out. A lot of people do need someone else speaking for them. And a strike is kind of like the top line of that.
Yeah, at the risk of just agreeing with you in principle, I think there is something to that the ability to withdraw one's labor is fundamental to that dynamic between workers and employers. Where I have some reservation, Amanda, is that the so-called right to strike is a relatively new one. When the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was codified in 1982, the freedom of association was pretty narrowly construed, and it was only a 2015 Supreme Court decision which effectively established the right to strike. And I'm kind of inclined to agree with Justice Rothstein and Wagner, who wrote the dissent in that case, that it was a mistake for the court to intrude in what was at that point a kind of legislative balance between public interest and the interest of workers and employers. And so I think we're bound to see more strikes moving forward, given this Supreme Court decision and the consequences, as you say, for basic public services, to say nothing of important economic parts of our economy, could be significant.
I think that's right. And I guess on the one hand, there have been recent examples where governments have moved to anti-strike legislation, to mandate back to work legislation. Let's go to the writer's strike, actually, because it gets us to this evolving part of the economy. Now, the writers have been striking for a while, and I happen to remember vividly I want to say it was 98, 99, but it was sort of the first time. Yes. There was a big Hollywood writers' strike. And as we all know, the consequence of that was The Bachelor. Reality TV was born. So if you need evidence of the evils that can be wrought by strikes, there it is, folks. And it'll happen again, right? We'll get more bad TV, scriptless TV, because of this strike. But there is a massive imbalance right now. I mean, our favorite programs, I have some, and I wait, breathlessly for the next season to come, depend on talented people who it appears don't have a lot of clout, which is amazing, right? Because what is a show without a writer? They're apparently underpaid. Apparently some of the safeguards around kind of how many people will collaborate together and whether they get residuals from the shows. Streaming has changed all of that, in the same way that we now have this debate about whether an Uber driver is an employee or not. So I do think we kind of need to find a way to empower people, and maybe strikes isn't the answer, but then I would say, what is the answer? How do we empower all these gig workers? And now we're including people like writers and soon maybe journalists, right? Once you lose the power, it's gone for good.
Just a ton of insight there, Amanda. As you say, our expectations around workplace standards and compensation and all the rest is trying to catch up with these big economic changes occurring in our society, including the rise of so-called platform-based workers. It seems to me, though, that in that context, unions also need to kind of reconceptualize their purpose and functions. Mm-hmm. It's worth noting for listeners and viewers that at this point, private sector union density in Canada is something like 15%. It has declined precipitously over the past few decades. And in that context, it seems to me it's up to unions to effectively make the case for their ongoing relevance. And in that vein, I wrote last February for The Hub about a new deal between the UFCW and Uber, what's called a company union deal, whereby the workers would have access to union functions and services, but just not collective bargaining. It effectively brought 100,000 new members into the union. And it seems, for me anyway, like an alternative model that could be the future of unions. The question, of course, is if they're prepared to abandon the kind of adversarial model and identify these new and different ways to represent workers. What do you think? Can unions reform themselves for the modern era?
I hope they can. I mean, I think we would agree they're going to have to, certainly in the private sector, because they have lost inroads. I don't know if they've lost relevance, but they've lost representation. A question for you, and I don't know the answer to this, but if you can, cite dissenting Supreme Court justices, I feel like you may have the answer to this. And that is, in that agreement with Uber, does the RAND formula apply? In other words, once Uber agreed to let them in the door, does every Uber employee have to join the union? Because that's always stuck in my craw. I hate the fact that if you work in a union shop, you have to be in the union.
No, it's a great question. I think the short answer is sort of, in the sense that it's a voluntary whether Uber drivers choose to avail themselves of the benefits and support of the union, and the costs associated of the union providing those services is borne directly by Uber in this particular case. So it's a relationship between Uber and the union, for the union to essentially extend its services to Uber drivers
if they want it.
But it involved UFCW conceding that it wasn't going to pursue the goal of trying to establish collective bargaining. So it had to put some water in its wine, but it increased its membership by 100,000 in one deal, which in an era of declining union representation is massive.
Yes.
And so, as I say, I think the question for union leaders across the country, are they prepared to effectively live with some of these new and different models that may look a bit different than it has in the past? But as you said earlier, we kind of all are, aren't we? Given that the economy looks and feels so much different.
Yeah, I mean, to me, one of the pieces of this that's so interesting, of course, is we may all agree that if somebody is going to, drive a car for us or deliver our food for us, they should be paid a living wage. The gap, of course, is, are we willing to spend more on those things? Because at the moment, of course, it is the service provider. And it appears, I hadn't realized the extent to which streaming had kind of changed the negotiating power and sort of the dynamics. Anybody can be a writer anywhere in the world for these shows. So and the good news for humanity, if you want to look at the optimism piece of it, is talent is ubiquitous and you get to access the entire globe, and that's amazing. The bad news is, of course, people lose their power and they get paid less and less for the work they're doing. And something does have to, I mean, let's agree that while we believe that, markets can ultimately settle these things, we're all in a barter process for our skills in exchange for something else. There is a bit of dislocation here, and people aren't being paid enough. If you're not being paid enough to live, then that's not enough. And I think, that's simplistic, but I think we can all agree fundamentally that we want people to be able to have a decent living. So I don't know, is it the union that should do that? Do companies need to step up? Do governments need to do more? I hate to introduce the concept of a minimum wage, but what is the lever you pull to say there's a lot of profit out there, folks, and a lot of new stuff, and people should participate in it?
Yeah, I would point to some policy innovation coming out of the Ontario government on these issues.
Interestingly, right? Yeah.
Yeah, Labor Minister Monty McNaughton, I happen to think is probably the most interesting conservative politician in the country these days. He's trying to apply his conservative principles about, as you say, the role of markets and choice and economic freedom and all the rest to a set of issues for which there's not an obvious kind of small c conservative or market-oriented response. And so they've been advancing these pieces of legislation and regulatory policy, including on platform-based workers, that I kind of get the sense is going to become the norm across the country. But let me put something to you. You mentioned that there are these issues going on in the market, but an area where the market isn't sort of part of the dynamic is in the public sector. And something we've written and talked a lot about at the Hub in the past several months is the growing divergence in the experience and perspective between public and private sector workers. We even saw during the PSAC strike last month that the union and his members effectively conceded that they were probably offside public opinion in this new era of different forms of work arrangements. I wonder how long taxpayers are going to be prepared to provide and sustain disproportionate work benefits in the public sector. What are you hearing in the business community, Amanda, about increasing government employment in recent years and the gap when it comes to health and dental benefits, pensions, job security, and so on?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big issue. And I think, honestly, you were the first person in the Hub that I saw identifying the extent to which hiring in and post-pandemic was public sector hiring. I think people were shocked by the data. They still are when I trot out your numbers. They can't believe that that's the case. And the piece of it actually that I think we need to concern ourselves most with is less the living wage and the job security, because those are good things. That people should be paid well and not fear firing. Now, do we need more flexibility on that? Will government have to innovate around how it keeps and loses people? I think so. But the pension is the one I think that will be our existential problem, right? Because we are headed, and we just, there's the demographic problem. Now, maybe immigration is going to help, but the demographic problem to me, Sean, is one that we all like to just whistle past. This has been going on for 20 years. We see it coming. It's still coming. And what we've done is, of course, loaded it with this extra layer of half of us are going to be looked after and half of us are not. And that's going to be, I think, a real problem. And I say things like, maybe pensions will have to be changed and clawed back, which is, that's a third rail, if you've ever heard one, right? That you have a bargain with somebody, but it isn't what it appeared. But there's some precedent for that, right? When companies run into hard times, they sometimes have to change the deal. Will public sector pensions be as generous as they promise? I don't know. I don't know how the math works out on that. But either way, it's going to be a big political problem that we have to face.
I think that's right. We've talked on the Hub Roundtable about the huge gap between the propensity for defined benefit pension plans in the public sector versus the private sector, where defined benefit pension plans have kind of gone the way of the dodo bird.
Yep.
And yeah, I do think there's something unsustainable there. It is worth observing that in recent years, we've seen some government agencies, not the core public service, but kind of arm's length agencies move to a defined contribution model. And I think you're right that we'll probably see more and more of that moving forward, because Bill Robson at the C.D. Howe Institute and others have just pointed out the significant liability that public sector pensions represent for governments and taxpayers. In a world in which people are working multiple jobs to make ends meet, I don't know how long they're going to be prepared to send their tax dollars to Ottawa for defined benefit pension plans. It's good if you can get it, but most of us don't have it these days. I just want to raise one other issue in the context of this conversation before we get to the most important subject of the week, which is the Toronto Maple Leafs and Florida Panthers playoff series. But that is recent data from a report by the Globe and Mail that shows that non-unionized workers have actually experienced larger wage gains than unionized workers over the past 5 years.
Right.
And that speaks to something we talked about last time we were together, and that is the role of tight labor markets and the impact that changing dynamic with respect to supply and demand may have for the power balance that we started this conversation with. You want to just reflect a bit on that?
And I mean, I think it's really important actually to remember those things, because of course there's much more flexibility in the private sector, and we've seen this. I've been intrigued at the extent to which we have much more real-time pricing this time around than in previous inflationary periods, for instance. So we're shocked at the grocery store, but it happens a lot faster. Now we want to see it happen on the way down as quickly, but we should be able to see, we're not quite at a real-time pay rail. We've been talking about that for a while in Canada, but we should be at a place where there's much more flexibility. And so now we have this tight labor market. The private sector has had to respond in some areas. We should note there's obviously huge swaths where there's not a lot of worker power still. But one thing that I think I wish we would talk more about, and I actually, maybe you know what the kind of policy reason is, but we don't, is in the private sector, as with collective agreements, you do often have these contracts that lock in your annual accelerator, so 2% a year or whatever it is. I don't know why that doesn't just actually adjust to inflation and do a real cost of living increase. Why all contracts aren't that way, because for many people over the last 15 years, they got paid less every year because they didn't have a cost of living increase. However small inflation was, it still existed. And I don't know why we don't bring that kind of thinking back. The only thing I'd say in the private sector is they can afford it. We have had one of the most extraordinary expansions of profit margin beginning in the 1990s, interrupted, of course, by a financial crisis, interrupted by some modest recessions, but a profit expansion that we've never seen the likes of. And so I would say most companies actually have the extra cash. It doesn't have to go back to investors. It can go to employees and everybody will still be fine. Yeah,
well said. Yeah, we'll continue to talk about this issue because I think it's one of these secular trends that is going to kind of shape economic outcomes in the coming years. And I would just say in parentheses, one of the most exciting opportunities is to pull people off the sidelines, people who've been marginalized in the labor force. I'm thinking Indigenous people, persons with disabilities. An issue that they've been that come back to Monty McNaughton that he's been working on is those with who've interacted with the criminal justice system. And so this is
before we leave Monty McNaughton, I just want to say really quickly, one of the things I like best about them putting the P back in progressive conservative is that it surprises people. And I love when anybody in public office can actually kind of upend any of the tropes, and just say, actually, you know what? When it makes sense, we will work with unions. And it doesn't matter which party's doing it. I don't really care. I just like that people can remember these things are complex. Nothing's black and white, and there's always middle ground to be found. And I think you're right. The Ontario government is finding it, and it's really refreshing.
Here's a subject, though, for which there's no middle ground, and that is the announcement on the part of the Florida Panthers that the team is refusing to sell tickets to playoff home games against the Toronto Maple Leafs to Canadian residents. What should we make of this, Amanda? Is this a new form of economic nationalism?
The thing I find most shocking about this story, and there's a lot that's shocking about it, is that people aren't more outraged. I've heard a lot of fans saying, yeah, they don't want too many of us in the stands. What if it were a different group? insert group here. And you would be horrified at that kind of exclusionary tactic on ticket sales. There's another layer to it that I find fascinating. That's that Ticketmaster went along with it. We can all hate Ticketmaster these days, whether you're a T-Swift fan or a Leafs fan. But I don't know why this is allowed. It's crazy. It's anti-fan. And, you know, a lot of Canadians obviously live down there and they'll find a way to get there, and good for them, go and cheer the heck out of it. But were you not shocked and outraged? And then I was more shocked and outraged that people weren't more shocked and outraged.
Yeah, I agree. And I this is a kind of a form of identity politics I can get behind, Amanda. The adding Toronto Maple Leafs fans to the list of persecuted groups.
Which, let's face it, it's a very woebegone group at the best times.
Well, maybe that's a good cue to wrap up our conversation. We're having this conversation on May 4th. Game 2 is tonight. I know I'll be watching. I suspect a lot of our listeners and viewers will, and hopefully the outcome is better than the last one. But this conversation was as good or better than the last one we had a couple of weeks ago. And I look forward to catching up again, Amanda, in a couple of weeks.
Same. It's great to chat.